Hello, everybody. Wonderful to be back. This whole project is meant to be, and I trust it still is, an exercise in vitality rather than mortality. But if you do Jewish history, you know, it can get tough. Inevitably, you feel at some point the melancholy gravitational pull of that Death Star revolving around Jewish history called the Holocaust. And I was very minded, and I say this to my publisher, who wanted the whole project to be one volume, dream on. Then he describes this as, in his way, are you out there, Dan? As volume 2 out of 9. It's not going to be volume 2 out of 9. The reason why I wanted this particular book, and it's called Belonging, the subtitle is really, in a way, the title, to stand on its own, was because I really had the sense in which Jewish history, in particular for people who are not Jewish, is just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and is just the Holocaust. And I wanted to give this multitude of Jews the sense of their innocent agency back again, not the assumption, even though, you know, the whole of our history is about being a suitcase people, you'd be very foolish not to assume that you should be prepared for the worst if the worst should come, in a way not just of pogroms and assaults, but summary expulsions which punctuate that long chronicle. But I did want to give them back the sense of vital energy. So there's as much simcha in these pages, I hope you'll find, as there is brooding on darkness. That said, as I said, you know, there is a lot of sighing going on in this book, and it was always like to start, and you know me, I always like to start and end with a joke, and I always think actually that the ultimate joke, which I know lots of you have heard before, but you will still laugh, that's an order. The ultimate Jewish joke is the shortest one too. It's just the waiters who come up to the two old ladies who've been eating the same thing in the same kosher restaurant for years and years and years, and leans over and says, "Is anything all right?" You know, the same can be said, really, of Jewish history. And occasionally, it's not that good, but okay, maybe it is. The same can be said of Jewish history, and there are things that are all right, for sure, as I'll hope to persuade you of through the course of this talk. But I'm very much minded to be a little bit in the Shadowlands to begin with. That next week is the celebration of the Balfour Declaration in Britain. It's already, I'm giving, you know, God help me, and he will need to help me, the Balfour Declaration Centenary Lecture, the eve before the anniversary, which is next Thursday, exactly a week from today, November the 2nd. And there's going to be a huge demonstration, and beforehand, of course. But a Jew's got to do what a Jew's got to do. Rabbi Hillel. So there I'm going to be. But it struck me that actually those 67 words which changed the whole of Jewish history, and indeed the whole of world history, can be boiled down in a way. So what are the two most important words in that letter from Arthur Balfour to Walter Lord Rothschild? And they are national home, of course. And so much of Jewish history is really about the meaning of home. It turns out, you know, for the Palestinians feel as strongly about the nature of their home too. And this is really a book about, I almost called it, I almost had the subtitle about Searching for Home, which is the title of one of the parts of the book, was the title of one of the parts of the book. But the title now is Belonging, which is also about looking for a home. And it's the subject, of course, which turns out to be the fulcrum of our very own zeitgeist. How can you live two lives at once? And here in this city, in this country, for the moment, certainly in this city, it's much less of a problem. In other words, when I say two lives at once, can you be fully American and can you be fully Jewish? That sounds a ridiculous truism to put to all of you in this place right now. But of course, increasingly and frighteningly, if we were in Budapest, for example, it would not be a truism, it would be a problem. If you're in Myanmar and you're a Rohingya, it's a problem. If you're a Hispanic who was born to illegal immigrants in Brownsville or El Paso, it has become a problem. What we're living through is a maelstrom of the politics of estrangement. Now, the Jews are lengthily not the only people to experience the politics of estrangement, by which I mean that moment when your neighbor, who you've lived beside for a very long time, suddenly looks on you as an alien. And even to the point where, of course, hundreds of thousands of people, I'm not talking about the Waffen-SS, I'm talking about Estonians and Lithuanians and Ukrainians and so forth, who were active participants, particularly in the period before the killing centers of the gas chambers, but who took part either passively or not so passively in the Einsatzgruppe and Accin and the kind of Holocaust of the bullets. That's exactly what happened to Jews in those communities, that suddenly neighbors made you into a stranger. So the central, poignant, acute question of where do you belong, how can you have two identities that mesh together, is at the heart of this whole story. And it unfolds, the beginning unfolds with a community who had taken a plunge to stop having this problem completely by converting to Christianity. And I'm talking, of course, of the Marranos, or the new Christians, or as the Emperor Charles V called them, the false Christians. You'll all know, I expect, that before the expulsion in 1492, that's the significance of the date, of course, the Spanish Jewish community in Muslim Spain, and then it became Christian Spain, split in approximately into three groups, each about 100,000 Jews. And there was an incredible wave of massacre and slaughter which took place in the late 14th century, whipped up by itinerant preaching, barbarically cruel Franciscan and Dominican friars, and something like 100,000 Jews were killed over a period of 50, 60, 70 years in a series of horrifying riots and attacks and massacres. A third of that community, so another 100,000, stayed Jewish very bravely, and that was the community which were expelled in 1492. One of the moments, I don't know how many of you saw the story of the Jews, which I did for PBS and the BBC, when Volume 1 came out. There was a moment, really, and I'm an old hand, as Tom very kindly said. I've made a lot of documentaries. But there are times, really, when you just become a ventriloquist, almost, for the ghosts that sing in your mind, and you want, really, to communicate without grotesque over-sentimentality to the viewing public. But there was a moment where I really lost my composure completely. And we were standing on a road outside Seville somewhere, trying to imagine what it was like for, finally, this kind of caravan of destitute, basically robbed, expropriated Jews to make it to Cadiz and the ports, to be gone out of Spain. And one little sentence in the document of expulsion really had got to me already. And it seems so incidental, but it was so freighted with tragedy. And that was Jews, apart from not being able to take any money of any substance out, no silver, they were forced to sell at grotesquely knocked down rates, of course, actually any property they owned. But they were not allowed to take pack animals with them. Donkeys, mules, oxen, which meant, of course, the only way, if you were taking a little bit of furniture, the only way you could deal with that was by actually pulling the handcart, So the able-bodied men and women were really pulling. We know that because actually there was actually one Dominican friar who'd been in the van of the rhetorical attacks on the Jews, and even his stony heart rather melted when he saw these sort of terribly damaged processions of people trudging by foot, with their few possessions and the old folk and the babies on the carts towards the port. And that was the point where I thought about what that represented, because it brought to mind, of course, similar processions of the uprooted in Europe in 1939, 1940, of the terrified and the uprooted. And a lot of the dark side of Jewish history, including dark side in this book, is really about the determination of other cultures. That's why Zionism had to be what Zionism had to be. the determination to make Jews in most cultures, not this one particularly. This was the great exception, as I think the Netherlands were, and to some extent, I mean, to a large extent, Britain too. But everywhere else, the determination was to make Jews never feel at home. That's why that Heimstatt was such an important phrase for Herzl and such an important phrase for Chaim Weizmann. And I thought when I was doing research on the pogroms of the 1880s, in Kiev, for example, it's very easy, well, we know from a whole number of people, if you went into a pogrom-struck city like Elizaveta or Tarnopol or Kiev in 1881 or 1882, what's the first thing you'd see? The answer, and there was, I've been talking about this book for a few weeks now in Britain and here, and I thought, wouldn't it be good to bring a huge sack of feathers, actually, and just throw it around the stage, you know, because I'm such an understated historian, as you know. And I thought, no, but that's what you would see, of course. That's the one bit that Fiddler on the Roof gets right, that actually you'd see feathers because the first thing, actually, that pogromniks would attack would be pillows and comforters and eiderdowns. And we know they would be stabbed and hacked. The furniture would be got at before people who are then got at in the most brutal way. And it's time, really, at that point, to tell you a kind of an upholstery joke, because it's just time to do that. So inevitably, but the best Jewish jokes are about upholstery and food and sex. So a Frenchman, an Italian, and a Jew are discussing how they respectively make their wives happy. And the Frenchman said, well, it's very simple. I take Normandy butter and I spread it all over her, and she screams with pleasure for hours. And the Italian said, no, it has to be virgin olive oil, and I smooth it over, and she screams for an afternoon. And the Jew said, we always use schmaltz, chicken fat, and I spread it all over she screams for days, and they were very impressed and said, well, how do you manage that? I said, I wipe my hands on the curtains, you know. No more jokes until the end of the, not allowed, but there are plenty of furniture jokes, really, but we won't do that right now. Back to the tragedy. Comedy tonight, tragedy tomorrow. Despite being Roman, that, of course, is a deeply Jewish show. So there is this sense, actually, of making your home provisional. And the people who decided that they'd had enough of this were those who converted to Christianity. But, of course, actually, in Spain, they were the target of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was always nosing around about whether or not the Marranos, and the Marrano, of course, to be a Marrano is itself an expression of contempt. It literally means swine. So whether or not they were secret Jews or were committing acts of Judaizing for which you would be, sent, you'd either, well, mostly you would be sent to the Auto da Fe, the living bonfire, which is not a happy ending. So there comes a point, really, where the experience of the conversos become unbearable, and particularly the conversos who have decided, they think, to make life a little easier for themselves by going to Portugal. That's a complicated story, but initially the King of Portugal said, we're terribly sorry about what happened to you in Spain, come to us, we'll provide you with it. We won't investigate exactly how Christian you're being. Most of the Marrano community married in church and did not circumcise their male children, but they were practicing, of course, Judaism in secret and remembered rituals and remembered moments of the calendar, including a form of informal marking of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat, and the major festivals. So the Portuguese community feels the hot breath of the Inquisition coming to Portugal as well, and it comes in 1536, and they need to get out of Portugal. And they need to find somewhere where they can provisionally, however provisionally, be at home. And that somewhere is the only place that could happen are the dominions of the Turkish Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan. You could go to Salonika or Crete or to preferably to Istanbul or to Smyrna, to Izmir, where my own family ends up much later, not coming from Iberia. We came probably from Aleppo, but certainly from somewhere in the Middle East. So we always called ourselves Sephardi trash, actually, the Shamas. Yeah, there was an old saying around our family that, and you've been warned about this, where Shamas go, empires fall, because we started with the Ottoman Empire. We had a brief period in the Habsburg Empire, saw that off, went to Britain, and here I am, everybody. You've been warned. So the Jews are anxious to get out of Portugal, and as it turns out, in fact, there are a group of incredibly rich Marrano Jews who basically are the great entrepreneurs of the international spice trade. The international spice trade, it seems very bizarre that in cinnamon and nutmegs and cloves and pepper, particularly pepper, so much money was made, but so much money was made at that time, so much money that the whole capacity of the Portuguese crown to mount an army and a navy depended on it. And it was run in particular by a family who had been called the Benveniste in the old Jewish days and were called Mendes. And they ran this extraordinary underground railroad, and which went all the way from the Tagus River all the way to Italy, which was the way station where you could get a ship that would take you on to Turkey. And they called this underground railroad, which was full of difficulty and ordeal and pain and terror, the Caminho Difícil in Portuguese, the difficult path, the difficult road. Always it began in darkness, in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the last dockside patrols had ended and the guards were snoring or whoring. Like small night animals emerging from the burrows, whispering cloaked figures would come to the quays on the Tagus River, carrying only what they needed for the 2-week voyage to Antwerp: a cooking pot, a mattress, hard biscuits, a little oil, a chest of clothes. The most reliable member of the family, not always father, would keep the purse of gold pieces close. Many more ducats than they would have needed had they not been new Christians. But they were people called Gomes and Dias and Lopes, who knew they had once been Cohen, Levi, Benveniste, and they needed to be out of Portugal before they were caught in the snapping jaws of the Inquisition. For a number of them, this was not the beginning of the flight from terror. Some had come to Lisbon from deep in Spain. Across the mountain frontier, they'd heard of great merchants, forced converts like themselves who got rich in the pepper trade, and Moses-like had opened a path in the sea. God willing, their wandering would not take 40 years, but they'd some idea when they loaded their carts that the way by land and water would be long and hard, and they were not wrong about that. When they made it into the ships and out of the Tagus estuary safely, and many didn't, they could make a lot of money about informing if the skipper, captain of a boat. You headed for London, where there was a secret Jewish community of about 100 Jews, and it strikes me that Shakespeare probably, when he was writing The Merchant of Venice, knew some of them. They were all secret Jews. They were all new Christians. One of them was physician to Queen Elizabeth I. But more likely you would want to go to Antwerp. Antwerp could occasionally, which belonged to, was a Habsburg domain, it belonged kings of Spain and Holy Roman emperors, was periodically subject, not to the Inquisition, had not yet come to Antwerp, wouldn't come until the other end of the 16th century, but was subject to a kind of tightening of the screws because, again, the Mendes family, who had a very grand house and an elaborately ostentatious chapel which concealed a very unostentatious synagogue down in the cellar, they were constantly being held suspect, and for the good reason that the Mendeses actually bankrolled this extraordinary road to safety, which from Antwerp took you up the Rhine, in other words, going south, down towards the Alps, and you'd get there by covered wagons and covered barges, and you were led by a series of people called the conductores, the conductors, who would tell you which inn was safe to stay at, when you could get on a barge, and you'd be handed from pillar to post, and you'd be kind of pretty much destitute except for the small amount of money you've been able to get from bringing a ruby with you safely out of Lisbon, and you'd be given money in exchange for that, in effect, by the Mendes agent in either London or Antwerp. If you made it across the mountains safely, and many did not, you were down in the plains of Lombardy, and there was a terrifying police force run by a man called Andreas Weisting, a Fleming, specifically waiting to catch you in the wagons and torture the elderly and the under 10s in order to extract information about when the next convoy of Jewish fugitives would be coming over, or to try and extract money from relatives or you if they thought you were still carrying tiny pieces of gold. And how do we know all this? We know it because of extraordinary research that's been done over the last 20, 30 years in the Inquisition archives. Enough arrests were made for people in extremis to be able to, who had no option while they were being tortured but to inform, and the routes could change as well, but to inform about what was going on. But we also know it from really the first vernacular historian in the Jewish tradition who wrote in Portuguese, a man called Salomon Usque. Beautiful, I mean, I do read Portuguese actually, but very, very, very slowly, but beautiful in translation. He wrote a book called The Consolação, the consolations for the trials and tribulations of the Jews. And so we get, weirdly, his kind of grand verse history of this experience, and he describes it very heartrendingly, of old women, Jewish women, just collapsing by an alpine pass, or young women giving birth on those frozen passes. It's profoundly moving. But what is also moving is that when you read Usque, who's part of a literary dynasty, actually, which also founds printing presses, you realize one extraordinary thing, which was a wonderful thing for this whole period, is that Jewish literature is really taking off in this period. It's no longer simply Talmudic discourse or even Kabbalistic discourse. It's no longer even Hebrew. There's a takeoff into vernacular languages, not just Portuguese, but Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, and in French, and even the Romanic Greek in Constantinople, and Italian, in Italian especially. And there is a kind of reason for this, not just because the kind of variety of audience is changing. It's no longer just about yeshiva education. Jewish writers are wanting to talk to people who aren't necessarily Jews. In the first, and they have a golden moment. It's a brief moment, but the brief moments keep on recurring. This brief moment occurs at the beginning of the 16th century, when there's a generation of humanist, curious, Hebrew-driven Christian churchmen, including the Pope, particularly Pope Clement VII. And what that results in is a kind of, not exactly spontaneous, because they seek each other out, a kind of comradeship of scholars between Christians and Jews. Now, the Jews are under no illusion that the purpose of coming together, Christian and Jew, ultimately is for the conversion of the Jews, because the whole timetable of the return of Jesus Christ depends, of course, on the conversion of Jews. But they also know, which is true, that the more benevolent of these Hebraist scholars are prepared to park, to kind of postpone this eschatological calendar for the purpose of actually sharing a sort of scholarly friendship. And those sorts of friendships actually stud this whole book. They happen generation after generation, century after century. The first one that's really heartwarming is between a very famous Kabbalist called Eliyahu Bahur and the Cardinal of Viterbo, who's called Egidio Antonini. And when Eliyahu Bahur's, well, he was obviously known to the Cardinal, because one of the ways in which Eliyahu Bahur, who was living at that time, I think, in Padua, makes his living is by actually teaching young Italian aristocrats to write Hebrew. And the way he does it, they copy out sacred Hebrew texts, the Mishnah, passages from the Talmud, passages from the Torah, and so on. That itself is an extraordinary thing. So when the army of the War of the League of Cambrai burns down Eliyahu Bahur's library and his library and his house, copies of some of the works that he'd most cherished had already been done by these Italian patricians. But more significantly, he's welcomed into the palazzo of the Cardinal of Viterbo, and not just him, but his whole very large family. And there they would have stayed, well, there they did stay until, unfortunately, the sack of Rome, which does Clement VII in 1523. That sort of companionship, you know, there's nothing really like proximity, physical, which makes this whole anti-immigrant, anti-refugee loathsomeness so upsetting right now. And it's shunda if any Jew ever subscribes that doctrine of estranging your neighbor, in my view. So watch out if there are any of you. And nobody coming to the 92nd Y has those views, do you? Don't answer the question. But there are so many of these examples of actually comradely proximity. There's a wonderful story of the man who is a great hero of mine in a book in Amsterdam in the 17th century, who I call the first Bible showman. He is the first Bible showman. He actually creates a scale model of Solomon's temple based on the description given in the book of Ezekiel and by Josephus as well. And it becomes an incredible tourist attraction in 17th century Amsterdam. And he strikes up an acquaintance with a Calvinist cleric called Adam Boreal. And they're interested in various esoteric Hebrew texts together and esoteric Christian texts. And Adam Boreal is a very advanced Protestant, so advanced that he doesn't accept the institution, by which I mean physical churches or governing churches of any kind. Thinks it's a sin against the Spirit of Christ. So he has a big kind of reading club in which Jews are invited, and to which Jews like Jacob Judah Leon, who was called Templo because of the fame of his model temple, come. And together, Templo and Adam Boreal embark on the exercise of telling people how to read the Mishnah out loud. There was no vocalization of the Mishnah, much less a cantillation chant of the Mishnah. That didn't really matter. So together, the eccentric Bible showman, is this bingo or lottery number, or is this, or am I being given points, actually, like Olympic for, is he holding up, I hope it's at least 5, anyway, for, so these sort of friendships, these comradeships are extraordinary. A famous one is Moses Mendelssohn and the playwright Lessing. They're very, very important. And there are places, of course, where the belonging issue, the Netherlands is one of them. The Netherlands, it really does work. This sort of sense, actually, of the possibility of being Dutch and Jewish relatively unproblematically, goes on, of course, until the Nazis occupy Holland, and the dockers then, of course, go on strike, famously, when the deportations start. And there are most of the places where it is possible to belong in these two complementary senses happen where authority is very decentralized. That's true, really, of the United States. There's a big chapter on the 19th century United States before the great waves of pogrom refugees from Eastern Europe arrive. It's absolutely true of the Netherlands, and in some ways it's true of Britain, which looks as though it has a centralized government and an established church, but really doesn't, because the church is so weak in 18th century England. And thereupon, another place, which again we don't think of as kind of liberal and tolerant, but was in the 18th century, is Poland, of course. And two things happen. First, most interestingly, is that an enormous variety of occupations are open to Jews. The kind of portrait of Eastern Europe that we have from Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem writes his Tevye stories while, sitting watching tram cars in Brooklyn. Not entirely, but the whole image, really, of the kind of mudhole shtetl with someone who owns 1 goat and 2 cows, or 2 goats and 1 cow. It's not, as there's fantastic scholarly writing about this. It's atypical of 18th century Poland. In a way, the great sort of Jewish culture in the Russian Pale of settlement goes backwards. It becomes poorer. It becomes more crowded. It becomes more exclusively to do with really broken down occupations or masses of Hasidic yeshiva bocher. But in the 18th century, it was possible. Here's what, if I find, here's what was available to Jews in the 18th century. The Jews of Poland and Lithuania were not in any sense stuck in the mud. Countless numbers were ceaselessly on the move, on wagons, in postcoaches, on horseback. Jews were horse people, even if they rode on non-Jewish saddles. My mother, this is true, spoke fondly of a Lithuanian great-uncle. We were the Steinbergs. My mother's family were timber people. I'm sure there were a lot of timber people in your family histories too, but that meant living in the forest. Didn't mean living in a kind of Anatevka kind of place. My family were lumberjacks and river rafters. Chaim Weizmann's family, Weizmann used to spend summers on these great timber logging rafts floating down the, I was going to say the Dniester, but it's one of the Vistula River. You ended up at Danzig, and then the logs were shipped on for the building trade in Germany. That was true of my family too, but we were horse and forest people. The two great occupations for Jews in Lithuania were keeping an inn, a lodging, distilling, because we had the monopoly of distilling in 18th century Poland, or logging, and again, there's an adjustment to one's expectations. My mother spoke of a Lithuanian great-uncle who she claimed rode bareback in traveling circuses. He certainly was a horse dealer, my great-great-uncle Hyman. Jews were water rats too, sailing shallow draft boats and along the great river basins of the Dniester and the Vistula. 1 in 4 barge and raft skippers was Jewish, their crews likewise. If Yiddish was the lingua franca of the trading Jews, for many of the more ambitious and far-roving, it was not their only tongue. There was nothing they wouldn't buy or sell, far and near. And this is a long list, but I want to give you a sense of the kind of carnival of possibility for Jews. In Poland, salt and saltpeter find calicos, muslins, batiste, taffeta and linens, dyed cashmere and rich brocade, grain and timber, wax and hides, iron and copper, dried Turkish peaches, figs, oranges, almonds, chocolate, cheese, opals, furs, sugar, ginger, spices, caviar, cognac, ink, parchment, paper, perfumes and potions, buckles and belts, cutlery and haberdashery, Chinese tea, Turkish coffee, amber and ironware, tar and coal, boots and ribbon, kid gloves and black fetal lambskins, Balkan tobacco, wine from all over, absinthe, brandy, fruit vodka, mead, amulets and elixirs, books and portraits, prints of rabbis, prints of Cossacks, friend or foe, they weren't fussy, micrographic etchings, which have become all the rage, pottery and pewter, lowing herds of horned cattle, flocks of sheep and goats, and in more places than you would suppose, Dubno and Rovno, for example, Jews sold fattened hogs and sows. They didn't have to eat them, after all. This is true. There were other places too in England, for obvious reasons, of which I'm fond. An extraordinary set of occupational possibilities opened up. The hero of another of the chapters of the book is a professional boxer. He's the first true international sports celebrity anywhere in the world. Why? Because he writes his memoirs. He writes 2 books. One is devoted to what he calls the science of pugilism, and the other is devoted to his own life and times. He opens an academy, a fight school. He creates generations of Jewish boxers. It's the way in, as it often is for minorities, to be upwardly socially mobile. He's the Sephardi boy called Dan Mendoza. And is there anybody here related to him? Because every single time I give this talk, someone said, oh, well, I'm completely descended from Dan Mendoza. Maybe not. Peter Sellers, the actor, claimed he was descended. Who knows if he was or not, from Dan Mendoza. Dan Mendoza changed the image of Jews in Britain completely. He was the most famous Jew. So this book is sort of full of these sorts of people who are not rabbis and philosophers and teachers and writers. There are plenty of those in these pages too. But it wants to take account of other kinds of Jewish life. Here's Dan. We know what he looked like because he made sure his portrait was everywhere, on mugs, on snuff boxes, on engraved glasses. He was good-looking, little Sephardi tough. Even when he was beating the living daylights out of an opponent, delivering a facer to that particular spot between the brows, which would bring on temporary blindness or a sickener to the mark, the pit of the stomach. There was something oddly cherubic about Dan Mendoza. The long lashes, fringing wide brown eyes, the Cupid's bow lips, the mass of dark curly hair grown long and artfully cut, tied at the neck with a black silk ribbon. I also want to say that Dan Mendoza, brilliantly, he's mentored by the kind of flower of the English working class, a man called Richard Humphreys, and they then fall out and they have a grudge match. Both of them, but particularly Dan Mendoza, realize this is a promotional dream, the ultimate Jew against the ultimate Gentile, and tens of thousands of people come to watch their epic. It's all bare-knuckle pugilism. It is very bloody and very raw, and it runs for like 30 to 40 or sometimes 50 rounds. One day that lovelock would be his undoing. He was too pretty to be taken seriously, and too short and too light into the bargain, 5'7", 160 pounds, the weight of an apprentice. But when he stripped before the set-to, the warm-up, the fancy, the high rollers, there was heavy betting on these people, saw the handsome head was planted atop a bull neck and a barrel chest, and they should have warned anyone taking him on they might not escape without a good deal of hurt. But one after the other, cocky bruisers looked at Dan and saw nothing but a dirty little Jewish tough from Mile End, chancing his arm. Go on. How much damage could an Hebrew do? Quite a lot, as it turned out. Mendoza had bottom, as Pierce Egan, the writer of Boxiana, recalled years afterwards, a bottom never impeached and possessing wind that was seldom disorder. Without bottom, the fortitude to take punishment and come back smack sharp from it. Without wind, staying power, you could have all the skill in the world and you'd still go down. But Dan had both, and more too, because he was reckoned the neatest stopper and the quickest hitter in the game. Others would deliver a more violent blow, but Dan would stop them with his hard arm as if they'd hit a rock, and then would counterpunch so quickly the barrage turned into a single rhythmic fusillade. If you were unguarded, the punishing counterblow, the one you'd be feeling days later, would be the Mendoza, otherwise known as the chop or chopper, a sudden upward or more rarely downward swipe with the knuckle back of the hand. To land those, you not only needed great rigidity between wrist and elbow, but phenomenal flexibility at the shoulder. Try a mock Mendoza in the air, and you'll see what I mean. Those who got chopped usually assumed a look of surprise. There were those, of course, who judged the Mendoza a typically Jewish trick, low down and dirty, but then they would, wouldn't they? The story turns, and I don't have time to be in... Goodness, time flies when you're having fun, as I hope you are. The story really turns, in a way, on the epic of the emancipation of the French Revolution, which is good and bad. It's wonderful, really, that at last Jews have civil equal rights enacted for them during the revolution, not by Napoleon. Napoleon, if anything, contracts it. And I want to say a little, he enters the story in just a minute or two. But that was very, very profound and important. And 2 generations later in the 19th century, in France and in Britain and in most European countries, the basic format of equal civil rights, conditional on losing the autonomy of the Kehillah as a self-governing unit, were guaranteed. But that's the rub, isn't it? That's the snag. A lot of the rhetoric in the French Revolution, famously, the champion of the Jews said to the Jew as an individual, everything. To the Jews as a community, nothing. Meaning this was a tough thing. Meaning you still didn't quite belong, because now the state would run what had been the kahal, your own community, for you. And that was the condition on which it was applied pretty fiercely in the so-called consistoire, the consistories. That was the condition on which you could have access to these equal rights, at least in theory. But understandably, Jews split over whether it was a good idea. The Sephardim, who were much more kind of acculturated, if not assimilated, in Bordeaux and southwest France, were so eager actually to have this deal that they were prepared to take it, even when it was denied to the Ashkenazim of Alsace and Lorraine. Eventually, they got it too. But there was always still this curious sense of unease, and of course, the tragic lesson by the time you were in the heart of liberal Europe, in Germany, in the middle of the 19th century, was that you got yourself into a kind of lose-lose situation. You'd be attacked by anti-Semites for being too stubbornly separate, and you'd be attacked by anti-Semites like Richard Wagner for being too assimilated, for dressing and cooking and sounding and speaking and writing like everybody else. When it was known by people like Wagner that this was just a front and actually your only allegiance was to each other. You belong to other Jews. A lose-lose situation. Herzl and Zionism came out of the perception of that lose-lose situation. And sometimes a poignant version of that, not spilled out in any direct way, could occur. One thing that happens to Jews, apart from the writing in languages which are not exclusively Hebrew, is that they write their autobiographies, they write their memoirs. This book is full of memoirs and diaries and autobiographies. Beautiful, beautiful things, moving, usually slightly tear-stained. What would you expect? But these are extraordinary sources. I mean, sometimes I felt when I was writing this, I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear all these people. It was like being in the kind of the ultimate nightmare bar mitzvah where everyone's shouting at each other, you know, and reaching for the gefilte fish balls. It's good to end with food, I think. This is not about gefilte fish. This is about cholent, which you all know. History laughs at grand designs. In the spring of 1813, as ice on the Beresina River melted and the human remains of the Grande Armée, bits and pieces of them, floated to the surface, Gabriel Schramek was taken prisoner by the Cossacks. He'd been one of the Jewish conscripts and had joined the section of the army which let him do what he did best, tailoring. After all, there was so much frogging and handsome coats and trousers to be made, repaired, and renewed. Nothing compared with the Grande Armée when it came to a beautiful parade. They killed with military glamour. But as the tide of war turned, patching up became the order of the day. Everything that could be reused was hats from the fallen resewn where shrapnel had shot through them, intact boots pulled from the feet of the dead. So much work to be done. Though Gabriel Schramek, like so many other Jews in the army, was always trying to find ways, as Napoleon suspected Jews would, of avoiding profaning the Sabbath while still fulfilling his military obligations. But by the early autumn of 1813, those anxieties, how to be a good Jew, how to be a good soldier of the emperor, seemed to belong to a distant epoch, to a dream. Now Gabriel Schramek, the military tailor, was himself in irreparable tatters, his Slavic captors the most famous Jew haters in the world. He was ragged, his body eaten away with suffering and the frostbite of the hellish retreat through the Russian snows. Now he was in Poland, what had once been Napoleon's ally, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Many Jews had served as its officers. Now they and it had disappeared. All Gabriel Schramek could think of was his growling, howling belly. He'd been offered fat and lard on mouldy bread by the Cossacks, but even in his extremity, he could not and would not gobble trafe. Better to die right there amidst the geese and the fields of standing rye. If he stayed true to the Torah, he wrote in his diary, God will have the heart to save me. But harvest time meant, he knew, it was the month of Elul. The Yomim Naroim, the high holy days, Tishri, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur were coming up. How could he observe them? Then one morning, in some village, some shtetl, not so very different from his own little hamlet in Alsace, Gabriel Schramek was given, if not an answer to his prayers and agonized mutterings, if not a ram caught in the thicket, then at least something. And this is his diary straight. The people of the village, with many young girls and boys among them, came to look at us. They had heard there were French prisoners. They were curious to see us. Among those people were Jews. They looked at us in their best Shabbat clothes. I was wretched with my swollen and frostbitten shoeless feet, crawling with lice. But I spoke to a young woman because I saw she had Rahmanas, compassion. I told her we were Jews too, asking if there was any way we could have a little food. And I even had a little something set aside to pay for it. She said yes, went back to her house, came back with a casserole full of semolina and meat still hot. She fed me this food with 2 spoons, but in truth, I couldn't eat very much because my stomach had shrunk so badly with the starvation. I left some of the food for the other prisoners and went off to vomit. Then I asked the woman how much I owed her, but she refused, saying, "This cost me nothing, and besides, it's the Shabbos. One is forbidden to take money for anything." And this is me now, is what it had all come to. The epic of emancipation reduced to a tatterdemalion starveling, desperate for a little Rahmanas, from Jews whose lives were untouched by the lofty rhetoric of philosophers. What was left of Gabriel Schramek, tailor, soldier of the empire, citizen Jew, fully vested in his rights, had in a way even he didn't fully comprehend, somehow come home to a pot of piping hot cholent. The Sabbath stew he'd wolfed down as a child, the morsel of pity, which in his distress of body and soul, now he could not keep down. Thank you very much.
Simon, you're a man of staggering and eclectic erudition, and as amply displayed by your reading of those passages, tremendously passionate and empathetic. And as a historian, as well as a Jew, this is a very interesting question. What has it meant to you to write about the Jewish story at this particular point in your life and career?
Well, notoriously, it's been it's a good question, Tom. It's a teshuvah, really, a return in every way. I did write a book of Jewish history. It's the second book I wrote called Two Rothschilds in the Land of Israel, which is now, suddenly, because of next week, topical again. But I did not have a particularly good experience doing it. And the reason was that you can divide historians, I think, ultimately into 2 types. Those who really want to write the culture of which they feel part themselves, American, British, whatever it's going to be. And those for whom history is a kind of journey towards people who are not like you. And I always wanted to be, I think Western history starts that way. It starts with the terrible twins, Herodotus and Thucydides. And Herodotus is an Ionian, and he's a gossip, and he's not an Athenian, and he's constantly in that part of the Aegean bombarded with all sorts of different people, in boats and ports, and he loves it. So it makes him a kind of anthropologist of the unlike, And so he was always very sympathetic to me. Thucydides, who is the greatest master of what might be called the political science of the dead, is so in his marrow an Athenian that the whole great masterpiece is structured around that ultimate catastrophe of the failed catastrophic expedition to Syracuse. So I was a kind of Herodotean in a way, and that's I was constantly hunting for trying to bring back, the Dutch, who you know very well, Tom, and the French, and as the year, and lots of German history and landscape and memory, Polish history and so on, and I was sort of like, suffering from the Jonah syndrome, kind of find me the next ship bound for Tarshish, anything. Partly it didn't help that all my aunts and uncles, after I published the Rothschild book, didn't talk to me again for years, actually. But I felt, no, there is something actually more difficult about writing out of one's own assumed familiarity. But then, you know, as the years went past, really, you go through lots of different experiences of return, actually. And I stayed actually very much engaged in Jewish historiography while not writing it. I ran a little sort of part-time seminar with Nicolas Delange, Amor Solz's translator, in my rooms in Cambridge on post-biblical history. So I was a kind of deep and hungry reader of scholarship, as I wanted to be. But I didn't want to practice it. And then, I don't know, when my parents were safely passed on, actually, I thought, my father did say, one of the wisdoms of Arthur Schama was, you always regret what you don't do. Mm. And I thought, I have to try this, but it was actually prompted by, when I finished, I think it was The Power of Art. No, it was the American Future of History. I had a phone call from a British television producer at the BBC, and he said, I've got an idea which you obviously have to do, and you're either going to love it or you're going to run a million miles away from it. And I knew exactly he was saying, you should do a Jewish history. And that got me, you know, thinking about, I didn't want to just do the television. I didn't want to just be a kind of, do a drive-through Jewish history. And there's a great history in the shape of Paul Johnson's history. But I did think there was a Jewish history to be done that was not just rabbis and sages and philosophers in the Inquisition, which is why I started volume 1 in a place most readers would be unfamiliar with, the Jewish garrison town of mercenary soldiers up the Nile called Elephantine. And the first sentences of my books are always, to me, very important. And the first one is, in the first sentence of volume 1 is about, I can't remember the exact words, but a father and mother worrying about their son, which appears in a papyrus, I think the one in one of the papyri in the Brooklyn Museum. So I did think there was, again, rather in a way I did The Embarrassment of Riches, a kind of deep anthropology, in a way, of Jewish life to be done. It was not just circumscribed by the yeshiva and by the Talmud and so on, while not thinking, you know, but instead would take in Daniel Mendoza or the first great actor-manager, who's a man called Leone di Solmi in Mantua in the 16th century, who writes the first book of stagecraft about makeup and costume and body language, and he's also a kind of unofficial rabbi. So he's extraordinary. You know, he does not make an appearance very much, except for Cecil Roth, who noticed how important Leone di Solmi was. So I was very much drawn to the lives of people who were unequivocally self-identifying as Jews, but Jews, you know, not yeshiva bachas necessarily.
You obviously connect intimately with the subjects of your narrative. If you were to choose one of the, let's say, headline figures of this period which you've covered, right, and someone, as you cited in the passages about the citizen soldier of the empire, anyone from any field, if you were able to have dinner with either of these two people, or with both of those two people, again, one grander and the other perhaps far more humble, but someone to whom you've created this incredible attachment, who might they be?
Well, everybody said, and it's got to be true, how charming Moses Mendelssohn was, and I believe it. And he lives, you know, in a way, which is distressing because his children convert, but he lives the possibility deeply and fully of that amity that I was talking about. And he was obviously very funny, and he was, but I would like to put him together with the first American Jewish showgirl, who's called Ada Menken. See how they get on. Who lives this kind of raunchy life. She pretends to be nude on stage. She actually has a flesh-colored body stocking. And she is born very much not Jewish, and she marries the son of a Jewish merchant in Cincinnati in about the 1850s. And she becomes not just a kind of passionate and exuberantly melodramatic Jewess, but writes extraordinary kind of proto-feminist Jewish poetry, most of which is slightly, even for me, cringe-makingly over the top. But it is fantastic. It's like kind of actress porn, really. So I'm going to read you a bit. She is really utterly wonderful. And Ada. And there's photos of her in the book. And yeah, this is great. She's Judith. I am no Magdalene waiting to kiss the hem of your garment. You know, forget about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It is midday. See ye not which is written on my forehead? I am Judith. I wait for the head of my Holofernes. Ere the last tremble of the conscious death agony shall have shuddered, I will show it to ye with the long black hair clinging to the glazed eyes, and the great mouth opened in search of voice, and a strong throat all hot and reeking with blood that would thrill me with wild, unspeakable joy as it courses down my bare body and dabbles my cold feet. This is not going to be played by Meryl Streep. And then there's a lot of, you know, she writes a wonderful poem, actually, called Hero Israel, which is much more vigorously feminist even. I think she and Moses Mendelssohn might surprisingly get on.
Clearly,
you're not convinced, I can see.
Clearly, there are elements in which the Jewish people are experiencing, as you put it, relative areas of tolerance. You cited the Dutch. Right. You also cited, which I don't think very many people today are aware, a particular era in Poland, right, in which the Jews were prosperous and relatively accepted.
Not all of them, but a surprising number.
Yes.
Were, yeah.
Not wanting to go into the third volume and the dark vortex.
Nor do I. I will.
What cocktail seems to be a common denominator in terms of the elements that are required to create a particularly harsh and intolerant setting for the Jews during this period?
Well, as I said, it all emerges out of the kind of lose-lose predicament they're in. And as we've experienced quite recently, when mass of people feel impotent in the face of unpredictable economic and other kinds of circumstances, they look around for scapegoats. And the most spectacular example of that is the Dreyfus Case. One of the most horrifying documents I discovered, really. I mean, it was there, but nobody's much commented on. Well, there were two sides to the Dreyfus Case, and I try and put them... I don't mean two sides, he's innocent or he's guilty. I meant that nobody had written very much about the fact that the Dreyfus Affair is the first non-fiction movie. In fact, it's the first drama movie of any kind at all. And there are Méliès brothers, and there is a kind of... The first motion news report happens at the time of the Dreyfus retrial in Rennes in 1899. So there's a good side, mostly, nearly always Dreyfusards. Méliès was a passionate pro-Dreyfus person. But then there's the other side, which is really horrifying. One of the forgers who botches a forged document, which is supposed to nail the incrimination of Dreyfus, and does such a bad job, is almost immediately exposed, two different pieces of paper, and he's basically outed as a pathetic forger, and he commits suicide in prison. And Edouard Drumont, the toxically prolific, violently vicious anti-Semite, who has made his fame on saying, if we have a financial crash, it's obviously the fault of the Rothschilds or the Perret brothers or Jews of one kind or another. They're pulling the strings always behind the scenes. He actually, he mounts a campaign for the so-called Monument Henri. The forger is called Major Henri, and this is to support his widow. But he invites people to say what they think should be done with the Jews. And this is an incredible catalogue of atrocities. In France, in 1899, no Nazi of the most feverish anti-Semitic SS variety could possibly have dreamed up things which are not already in that document. What should be done with the Jews? Well, they should be turned into dog food. Since they like music, their guts should be used to string instruments. They should be used. Poor animals should not be used for live vivisection. We'll use Jews instead. No, the other one said, no, they stink too badly. People will run away from the dissection room. They should be burned alive in glass furnaces. Wonderful, we've got Jews because we can test our new cannon armaments out on them. A mother who just had a baby a week before said, I know now I'm going to bring this baby up to be an anti-Semite, and on, 25,000 of these in France in 1899. So the thing is the sense in which there's the Jewish bet in Germany and other places, in liberal society, which was a reasonable bet, was that things, when you were in the professions, you were in law and medicine and science, and you opened the first department stores, things were ultimately going to get better for Jews, and the old hatreds would go away, and modern life would at last deliver Jews from the burden of this hysterical medieval Jew hatred. But modern life took a very unexpected turn, as it did in the last election. Modern life in the middle of the 19th century became tribal, became Wagnerian, became absolutely flush with the hatred of the metropolitan city, of cosmopolitans, as Steve Bannon would say. So this was incredibly bad for the Jews.
So happy that you opened the door to this, because there are several questions in which our very elevated audience would like to be able to hear your views, being one with a very broad sweep and able with that broad sweep to be able to narrow in on the important elements. Where are we today in terms of latent as well as overt anti-Semitism, and are there any canaries in the coal mine that you see as being something that the Jewish community should concern itself with?
Well, the one, because I lead this transatlantic life, really. I'm here, but I'm in Britain quite a lot. And the most obvious thing which you know about, Tom, and everybody here knows about, is the way in which the most extreme, sometimes not the most extreme, forms of anti-Zionism have morphed into anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionists complain that, well, we're not allowed ever to criticize Israel because we're accused of being anti-Semites. And we're accused of being anti-Semites because the Jews control the media. Hello, just proved our point. And this sort of extraordinary sense, actually, that of a kind of Jewish conspiracy. In France, it's almost impossible for a Jew to go on the streets wearing a yarmulke or wearing a kippah. That's becoming quite difficult. It's a serious problem on campuses in Britain. It's somewhat of a problem in some campuses here. So, of course, I'm a fierce critic of much of what the Israeli government does, particularly in the occupation and on the West Bank and the extension of settlements and so on. So it's, of course, not the case that the Jewish community is always kind of in lockstep with whatever Benjamin Netanyahu happens to decide. But there is, to my mind, you said canary in the coal mine, and there is, we don't, even Charlottesville, I know it was really appalling to have swastikas in the streets of Charlottesville, for sure, but we don't have a kind of Nazi party on the move. I think there are very few parts of the world where we do, but if you're just looking at where is the next Hitler? You're getting it wrong. It's much more insidious than that. You can get to demonizing Jews by, as I say, this kind of insidious, rather toxic graft between special interests allegedly preventing criticism of Israel. So there is a kind of weird, bad marriage between these two bitter forms of rhetoric. And in Britain, at least, there are plenty of rather brave British Muslims. The Quilliam Foundation and has been sterling about that, who've actually called out anti-Semitism among the most extreme kind of pro-Palestinian activists. But the Labour Party is actually rife with this edgy kind of... I mean, when you had Ken Loach, the filmmaker, on camera saying all history is up for discussion, including the Holocaust, so he was kind of quasi-Holocaust denier, you're in a very bad spot.
No, the Labour Party, I mean, Corbyn has tolerated the intolerable.
Yeah. I think Corbyn's resistance to this has been grudging. He comes, interestingly, I think where he comes from is the kind of Soviet version of anti-Semitism, in which right from the beginning, beginning of the Russian Revolution, we're commemorating, if not celebrating, 100 years of that. By the way, if you haven't read Martin Amis's spectacular article in the New York Book Review last weekend, you should, on the October Revolution. We're commemorating that, and the Jewish intelligentsia, and that, which included not just grandiose intellectuals, but the notoriously mouthy, wordy, spectacular, febrile life of ideas, not just Jewish religious ideas, all over Russia, was a huge constituency to compete for between the communists, the social revolutionaries, the Bund, the Zionists, and so on. So once the Bolshevik dictatorship was established, it was very important to wipe out Zionism, really, as a kind of petty bourgeois reactionary, racist, reactionary, narrow, particularist movement, and to forbid Hebrew. Yiddish was okay, Hebrew was not. And I think, and that went on a long time. I have no doubt in my mind, along with a lot of scholars who actually know about the Russian, the late stages of Stalinism, the Doctor's Plot was extremely frightening. The late roundup of intellectuals in the early 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s was terrifying. And some scholars think really there would have been something akin to a massive Soviet-directed set of pogroms, if not actual genocidal onslaught against Jews, had Stalin not died.
The Doctor's Plot?
The Doctor's Plot being the most egregious. Had he not died when he did. So I think Corbyn has inherited those sorts of ideological cliches about anything called Zionism is intrinsically reactionary to the point of racism.
Let me ask you this. While arguably there's no reason why people cannot take issue with the Israeli government and not be anti-Semitic, the line seems to be crossed when it means applying a double standard to the Jewish state that is not applied to everyone else. So people don't boycott Chinese goods because of the occupation of Tibet and Russia in Central Asia, etc., etc. It's also clear that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not at the core of the instability in the Middle East. Far more credit could be given to the Sunni-Shia schism, to the collapse of authoritarianism. But one thing in which Arabs...
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you about that, but...
Well, no. One thing that Arabs will commonly agree on is, though at this point, most, and I spend a lot of time in the region, will acknowledge that clearly this is no longer their number one priority. They're much more concerned, for example, about Iran. Nonetheless, it is an emotional issue within the Arab street, and even those countries which are not democratic, in fact, almost all of them are not by what we would call democratic. Nonetheless, they would love to see movement on that issue. Is there a Schama plan for Arab-Israeli peace?
Well, I have more of a plan than Jared Kushner, that's for sure, who's supposed to be solving it. You all have more of a plan than Jared Kushner. No, I'm really you know, and unfortunately, an old Labour Party person, I mean, you know, we came so close to an agreement in 2008 between Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, and they walked the Green Line together. They agreed on the exchange, the swap of territory. It was agreed, which is unthinkable now, with Netanyahu beholden to the likes of Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman. They agreed that Jerusalem, which, if all of you know, Jerusalem is de facto, you know, governed by two separate entities anyway. They agreed it could actually be the joint capital of Israel. And this is news to most people, but that was part of the agreement. It fell apart on the Palestinian side mostly, I think, but Tzipi Livni in particular has never really got over how close they were, and it could indeed have happened. But we have a sort of changed, you know, constantly changing landscape. The difficulty with I'm a two-state solution Zionist. I always have been, because everybody, what is the alternative? We're constantly being told the two-state solution is dead as a dodo, and we have to think about something else. Well, what can that something else be? A one-state solution is either we're going to be outpopulated by the Palestinian population, in which case we'd rule, if we want to keep a Jewish state, we'd rule as it would be somewhat like South Africa. I'm very hostile to Israel being compared to that, but we'd be a minority Jewish state ruling over majority. It's true that the Jewish demography is growing and growing. Or the alternative is that somehow we no longer fulfill the dreams of the founders of Israel, of Chaim Weizmann and Ben Gurion, and of Yitzhak Rabin, that we are no longer a Jewish democracy. We actually forfeit. And the most upsetting thing about the most extreme bits of the settler movement and the most extreme of the ultra-Orthodox politicians in Israel is that they don't care that much about Jewish democracy. For them, the Torah is all that matters. And a Jewish democracy for some of those people is a kind of oxymoron. They're not that interested in what Ben Gurion might have had to feel about the Jewish state. Well, I am. It's very important to me that the original moral, ethical nobility of Israel survives and flourishes. So this is what we're facing. And I know you go to the Gulf a lot, Tom, and the further away you get from the West Bank and Israel, the more these soothing noises. And they're right, of course, to worry about a kind of huge pan-Iranian Shiite empire and all the rest of it. And we're already seeing, you know, the problems of a vacuum of power happen in northern Iraq, and God knows what they'll be like in Syria. That's all true, but it doesn't change the fact that we have two kinds of anguish going on in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And
absolutely true.
Yeah.
What I would add, however, is that on these trips to the region, I have never seen a greater desire by these people, admittedly, they're not on the West Bank, they're not in Gaza, to open the prospect of complete recognition and
well, let them do it.
And integration, but it takes two to tango. And let's face it, you have a coalition government that is not leaning towards being a profile in courage when it comes to.
You're talking about recognizing a Palestinian state.
I'm not talking about recognizing. I'm talking about a greater recognition. You have an alignment of the stars from an Egyptian government that sees alignment with Israel, to the Gulf monarchies, to Jordan, who would love to be able to see the Palestinian issue dealt with, so that they could be able to have Israel as part of the equation.
No doubt.
And so
I'm hoping
that it would happen.
What are you saying the problem is then?
The Israelis.
No, I think, well, you know better than me, I'm sure, but the Israelis, I think.
I'm talking about the government.
Yeah.
The coalition does not lend itself. You'd have to be able to be willing to break up the coalition and realign Israeli politics.
Well, if Netanyahu goes in the slammer, which, you know, inshallah, then we can start all over again.
Well, one thing, if I may, I'm going to take the liberty of being able to take advantage of the fact that we were in the green room, and you are actually engaged in multiple ways in trying to build bridges in that region.
Yeah, in a very, very
and you spoke about an absolutely wonderful organization. Yeah. And I think if could you give him a shout out?
Let's end on a light note, but I have to end on another joke. It won't involve sex or upholstery. You can relax, but it does involve ornithology. But before we get to that, yes, no, I mean, when you actually go to Israel, there are tiny points of light, but I do cherish them. Some of them feature in the last program of The Story of the Jews on TV. One of them is schools in, there are now 6 of them around the country. It started in Jerusalem, called Yad V'Yad, Hand in Hand, which were founded by Palestinians and Israeli Jews and teach both in Arabic and Hebrew. And these kids really are, the wonderful thing is that they're not in some sort of peacenik crusade. They are just teenagers who want to hang out together. But the sad thing is, and the governing board is absolutely half Palestinian, half Israeli. It's fantastic. And they're wonderful schools. But the sad thing is they're all pals with each other, but they can't go walk down the streets of East or West Jerusalem with each other. They would invite physical attack by their own other chums. So always these kind of shadows. But one which is not totally without shadow, but a wonderful, do go to your websites, everybody. It's called Eco Peace. And I was saying to Tom, you know, there are some practical things. You actually find it in the film industry, in the music industry, in sport sometimes, that there are certain places where Israelis and Palestinians just park the narratives of mutual hatred and the Nakba versus the Shoah, and just get on with something else. And Eco-Peace is concerned overwhelmingly with water. There are many water disasters. There's a terrible kind of pollution of water in Gaza, which is not much better. The Dead Sea is losing something like a meter a year. It's catastrophic what's happening to the Dead Sea. The Jordan River flow has been horribly kind of constricted by erosion, which has been caused by excessive building by both Palestinian and Israeli developers. And Eco-Peace has offices in Ramallah and in Amman and in Tel Aviv. It was started by a real hero of mine called Gideon Bromberg. And they meet regularly, and they are the kind of working organization where you have a little, you know, lightness of heart. All is not about hatred and memory and bitterness, which brings me to Moshe, who had as a legacy from his friend, as Jews sometimes do, a parrot. You have no idea how many Jewish parrot jokes there are. The one you all know is the Chassid who walks into a bar with a parrot in his shoulder, and a bartender says, "Where'd you get that?" And the parrot says, "Brooklyn. There are thousands of them there." But the other parrot, Moshe gets the legacy of a parrot, and the trouble with this parrot is a shanta. He just will not stop swearing. He F's and blinds, and you know he likes to have the rabbit and the rabbitson around for tea. It's embarrassing, and so he shouts at the parrot, no good. He puts the baize cloth over it, screaming, effing and blinding. Locks it in the closet, no good at all. So in desperation and out of control, he opens the capacious freezer of his fridge, and he shoves the parrot in there. And not long after he's shut the freezer door, he's not feeling good about this. And he's listening. There's a kind of vague, dim squawking going on from the freezer. So he pulls the parrot out, who's pretty stiff by now, but parrots being what they are, he can talk. And the parrot says, "Oh, master, I'm deeply mortified, sorry. I will obey you in all things and be a respectful parrot." And Moshe is incredibly surprised. And then there's a pause, and the parrot said, and by the way, what was it that the chicken did?
And
thank you.
We started with schmaltz, we end with schmaltz. Thank you.
See you at the signing.